You are about to enjoy a production of the Ella Wellness Network. This is Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, and I'm so happy you're here. Welcome to the Wellness Sisterhood. It's time to break it down for the Wellness Baddies. Welcome back to Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy, a pelvic floor physical therapist, and the owner and founder of the Ella Wellness Sisterhood. And this is a new little series that I want to do based on the interviews that I have with experts within their field. So I wanted to do this for a few reasons. One, I feel like a lot of the time we hear these like sciencey episodes, we're ready to like put them into action, but we don't know how, right? So we struggle taking that science and that knowledge that we learned during the podcast or during the video or during that research paper, whatever it is, and putting it into actual action. So I want to talk over that and how I've implemented, whoever the expert is, whatever they talked about, how I've implemented what they were educating on during the podcast in my life throughout that week. So my thought is that I'm going to be dropping these episodes immediately after, like the week after the expert interview. So for this one today, we're going to be covering Dr. Katie Hirsch's interview over female-specific nutrition, training, and performance. And she was such a wonderful expert to have on, literally a dream guest, because a lot of her research is what I refer to when I am looking at what to do for my own body, how to train, how to fuel, and then also how to help patients. So today we will debrief her episode. And again, my goal is this global community of wellness sisters who are focused on education, but then also action. I want us to be not only educated on our bodies, but also inspired to take action in whatever we are learning about our bodies. So today we'll cover some of the top points she covered in her episode. I'm going to think of this like a little bit of a book club almost, like, okay, our podcast club. We went over the episode with Dr. Katie and I interviewed her. I tried to get as much in that episode as I could, but now let's debrief together. Let me kind of pull out some of the top points. That way you can use these as sort of like a part one with the expert and then a part two where I sort of break it down. And again, I'm totally open for names. I was polling my sisters on like names to call this, and my middle sister who you guys met, if y'all haven't met her or watched the 30th birthday episode, go back and watch that one. It's back in January. I can't remember what episode it is, but I'll link it. But she was like, what about breakdown for the baddies? And so that's sticking. But if you guys have a better name, I'd love to hear it. But there's a few reasons I want to do these sorts of episodes. One, I want to inspire action. I want to give ideas for where I've been challenged throughout the week, putting some of her education and expertise into action in my own life. I want to make sure that you guys feel like you have enough tips and tricks to implement what she talked about and what these experts talk about each week on the podcast into your own lives. The other reason I want to do this is for repetition. It's the reason I do the Hotter and Smarter in 5 episodes. It's the reason that I do this episode, and it is repetition and hearing things repetitively over and over and over again so that they stick. And again, this is kind of a part one, part two sort of take on it all, because if you're joining us only for part two, make sure pause, go take a look at part one where we actually interview the expert, and then come back for part two where we sort of, again, break it down. We pull some of the top points, and then we chat about tips and tricks to actually put their recommendations and their expertise and their education into action in our own lives. And then the last reason that I wanted to do these is because a lot of the time these expert guests are volunteering their time. They are researchers, scientists, professors, experts in their field in whatever way, and they are like so kind to be able to volunteer their time in order to come on Wellness Fixes the Pod and share this information with me and with you guys too. And there's only so much time that I could take up, and there's only so much of their time that I want to take up, right? I would rather them be able to willingly volunteer their time in a short time frame, and then me with you guys go over some of the stuff that we talked about in the episode later on. That way, if there's anything that's confusing too, you guys can reach out to me and be like, hey, when Dr. So-and-so said this, or when this person said this, or whatever, when this expert said this, I was confused on that. Can we dive in deeper on the Breakdown for the Baddies episode so that I understand that a little bit better. So, my goal is to get as much valuable information out of the interviews with the experts during the time that I have within that hour that I'm trying to keep those episodes within for our sake, as far as not to have lengthy episodes, but then also for their sake, so that it's not taking away from their professional and personal lives, because they are so kind to volunteer to share their passion and expertise with us. And so my hope is that on Breakdown for the Baddies, we can actually like dive in a little bit deeper and sort of clarify some of the things that they talked about, pull out some of the top points, and then also provide some actionable tips. So I'm so grateful for these expert guests, but I don't want to take any more of their time to explain some of the basics that I know that I can cover on Breakdown for the Baddies. So that's the reasoning for these episodes. Again, it's kind of like my thoughts and my knowledge and expertise from like a physical therapy movement body standpoint combined with their expertise, their knowledge, me interviewing them, cool things that I pulled out of that interview, and sort of top points. So it's a kind of a part one, part two. And my hope is that if you're joining in this like Breakdown for the Baddies episode and you haven't listened to the expert interview, go back, listen to the one right before this, because I'm going to drop them back to back. That way, again, it's fresh in our minds. We're repeating the information and we're also clarifying, simplifying some of the concepts, and putting them into action and learning how to put them into action in our own lives. So we'll dive into Dr. Katie's episode. And again, Dr. Katie was so, so kind. She actually linked me with a guest that will be coming on very, very soon, who is a registered dietitian. And she has agreed to do a part one, part two episode because she covers female nutrition throughout the lifespan. So I am like so, so grateful for Dr. Katie, not only for sharing her expertise on our podcast, but also for linking me with other experts within the field, because it's just a wonderful like girlhood community trying to like lift up women and lift up female physiology and like the knowledge around the female body. And I just like I could cry tears of joy because I had just emailed asking, and she was so willing to come on the podcast and so willing to promote and sort of link me with other people in the industry that might also provide valuable information for all of us. So I'm so, so grateful. Dr. Katie is a female physiologist. She's a professor at the University of South Carolina, in addition to a researcher there. Again, you can go back, listen to her episode. She's got her PhD in human movement science. She's got her master's. She's got her undergrad. Like she's a registered dietitian. She has this really all-encompassing view on the female body from the nutrition side, from the training and performance side. And a lot of her research looks at the menstrual cycle, creatine supplementation. I would have loved to ask her more about menopause, so maybe we'll be able to have her on for that, because all the questions that I gave her, like that I had prepped and planned, we didn't get to, I think we only got to like half of them because I just like thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and enjoyed where it was going. So I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. But pulling some of the top points from her exercise, we'll start with female specific fueling and nutrition. And I feel like one of the top points that I really want to highlight is comparing intermittent fasting and fasted exercise and just caloric restriction when it comes to like or again, fasting before exercise compared to fueled exercise specifically for women. And I mentioned in the podcast that I started doing a lot of fasting after the Peter Attia and Chris Hemsworth documentary. I forget what it was called, but it was on Netflix. It was a great documentary. But I realized after reading Dr. Katie's research and some of her colleagues' research that doing exercise fasted is actually detrimental for a woman, because it cues our brain and our body to signal the breakdown of necessary tissue that we actually want, like muscle tissue, rather than utilizing the glucose that we have in our body, right? So a lot of the time when we think about, she brought it down to like the survival mode, if we are reproducing and we are supposed to be like building a new human, our bodies are going to be more sensitive to the available energy that we have within our bloodstream. And so we have to have this higher baseline in order for our body not to be cued to mobilize more resources to create more energy for us to, again, from a survival standpoint, like grow a human, right? But the same thing happens with exercise, where if we're stressing our body in a certain way, we want to be able to cue our bodies like, hey, we have enough energy to pull from within our bloodstream, like immediately usable. You do not have to go and break down our muscle, which is what we want, or any other of the tissues that we actually want. So one of the top points, it's important that we as women especially fuel prior to our exercise. And she recommended 30 to 60 minutes before fueling with either a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 carb to protein ratio. And again, maybe increasing that carbs component if you're doing more of an endurance-based exercise or training for an endurance-based race like triathlon, marathon, long runs, swimming, things like that. And then after a workout, she recommended refueling and replenishing those reserves in a 1-to-1 ratio. So 1 part carbs to 1 part protein, or 2 parts carbs to 1 part protein if you are, again, training for something or having these higher energy demands. She also mentioned, and something that I want to point out because I think it's going to take us a while to flip the mindset as women and as a population of women, to realize that fueling before the workout can actually help improve our metabolism and our fat utilization after the workout. So not only are we, like, it seems counterintuitive, right? Fueling with calories before, isn't that going to put us at a, greater amount that we have to expend later on in that calories in, calories out formula that we're all used to? But in reality, it's cueing our bodies. It's almost like the stimulus for our bodies to say, hey, we have the energy resources that we need. We have the fuel that we need. We can do this workout, and then it'll improve our metabolism and fat utilization even after the workout. Another top point that we mentioned and that Dr. Katie mentioned during the episode was regarding purpose and viewpoint. So when it comes to social media and marketing in general, like the Chris Hemsworth and Dr. Peter Attia documentary, who is that target audience? Like, okay, yes, as a consumer for enjoyment, that target audience is me, but Dr. Peter Attia was giving recommendations for Chris Hemsworth, for this very fit, very muscular male, right? So when we're looking at certain supplements or certain amino acids or certain fueling or training recommendations, she made the good point to think a little bit deeper behind the wording to see who is that targeted for. Because again, like I had asked her in the episode, it's thinking about carbo loading, right? A lot of the times we would carbo load as kids before our swim meets, and she's like, "That's great. That's good for a certain type of individual who's training in a certain way." But that's where we have to think a little bit deeper and be like, "Okay, who is that message, that diet, that performance, that training workout regimen? Who is that targeted for? Am I the target audience? If not, let me say it doesn't apply to me because again, I'm not in that stage. I'm not training for that event. I'm not that, male, right? In the example of the Chris Hemsworth documentary. So I think that was a really good point to think about a little deeper behind some of the messaging that we get, because that's where some of this confusion can come from. Is like, who is that targeted towards? And is it targeted towards me? And is it something that I need to look into for my own body? Or is it certain noise that is in this like health and fitness space that's good noise for some people, but for me, I need to just brush it to the side. So I thought that was a really important point that we didn't get to spend too much time on. But looking at certain Instagram accounts or social media accounts or YouTube accounts or advertising and seeing, okay, who is this targeted for? Is this something that is going to align with who I am, as my like biology, as my physiology, as my training goals, as where I'm at in my life? If someone's promoting this, multi-hour a week exercise program, do I even have time for that? Am I the target audience for that? So I thought it was a nice point to make that she brought up, and I wanted to highlight that as part of the episode. Another top point, and my sister actually brought this up as something that she enjoyed, was talking about the everyday athlete. And again, I tried to ask questions knowing that most of us are everyday athletes. We might train for something every now and then. We might have this goal in mind. We can show up for ourselves and work out, but we're not necessarily these professional athletes, or training and nutrition and fueling and recovery is not our primary like job, right? Like it's not something that we can dedicate so much time to. So my goal is to really sort of simplify it, and my sister really grasped onto that the everyday athlete phrase, because she was like, "Oh my gosh, I love that," because that's exactly how she feels that she is categorized as, right? Not this professional athlete, but also not someone who is just like sedentary. We are everyday athletes. So she loved that, and I wanted to bring that up as like, that's me and you, right? We are all everyday athletes, and some of us might be in different stages of that, but knowing what stage we are at in our nutrition, training, and performance can go back to that point before of like, what is this messaging targeted towards? Is it targeted towards me, or is it targeted towards someone that is not in the same stage as me, whether that's the stage of training, performance, nutrition, or life stage even, or again, like I said, physiology or biology. Another top point she made was on low energy availability and red S. And she mentioned red S a lot in the beginning, and it is reduced energy deficiency in sport, or I've also heard it called relative energy deficiency in sport. And she talked about the calculations of it, but in general, it is not having enough energy for the demands that your sport places on you, whether that be from fueling, whether that be from overtraining, whether that is a metabolic component, whether, whether that's like a off season or in season component. Like there's all sorts of these different factors that play into red S. And she mentioned that briefly, but we also mentioned that with low energy availability, which can apply to a lot of different, it can apply to the everyday athlete, right? It's that spectrum that she mentioned. And I loved that she called it a spectrum, because in my head, when I think of low energy availability, and we learned it all through school, but it was like the extreme ends where people are over exercising, under fueling, and this like super stick like physique a little bit, when in reality, I do feel like I fall on that spectrum in that middle range. And Dr. Katie had said she falls on that spectrum sometimes in that middle range of not fueling enough. And I think it's important for us to think about it on a spectrum and realizing, oh, hang on, maybe I'm not actually getting enough fuel for my body in order to power me through the day. She mentioned fatigue as one of the signs and symptoms, menstrual cycle irregularities, poor recovery, poor cognitive state. There's a lot of different things that can signal low energy availability across the spectrum. So just to be aware of that. And again, remember the importance of fueling, especially for our female physiology, knowing that our body responds quickly and maybe not in the ways that we want if we are fueling inappropriately and not fueling enough. So switching a bit to the creatine, and I'm so excited that we spent so much time on chatting about creatine. And my plan is actually to go through some of those resources that she gave us and that are linked in the show notes, and actually go through it almost again like this breakdown for the baddies, where we sort of break down some of those research articles that she had mentioned in the podcast episode, to bring some like education, but also like applicability to our own lives from those articles and resources that she mentioned, because I think people are out there researching it. We should share it and actually put it into action. But one of the things she mentioned, and one of the things that my dad actually listened to this episode, and he pulled out some things from it too, because creatine's not just for females, right? It's for males too. And I told him, I was like, I really want you to listen to this part of the episode, because I think it's really important for you and for everyone. But he pulled out, he was like, I like how she had said power fibers. So thinking about creatine as this assistance for these explosive movements, these power-based movements. And he was like, I never thought about that. Or even like, I was talking with someone the other day, standing up from a chair when we're older, that is a power-based movement. That is somewhere that creatine can help. And so he really picked up on that as a way that as he's aging, to help fuel his muscles and his body in the right way. I also want to focus too that she had mentioned creatine helps muscle mass, but it can also help so many different other parts of our body, like brain health. So I mentioned reaction time as a physical therapist. Again, that's where when I think of like power and brain health, I think of reaction time, because balance, fall risk, all of these things start to decline as we age. And I've seen so many patients who struggle with balance, reaction time, fall risk, and a lot of us will start to struggle with those later on. So if there's even a supplement that can help now, that is heavily researched, heavily backed, that we can start to implement now, I wonder how much more that's going to affect us in a positive way later on. And even, maybe there's going to be studies, and maybe there are, I haven't gotten to check them out too much, about creatine supplementation in our older years as men and women. So I think that's really cool and a really great point, not only for the muscle benefits and the bone benefits that she was mentioning, but also for the brain health benefits and just the longevity benefits. We also mentioned a study about creatine loading during the luteal phase, helping our overall feelings of puffiness and then also our recovery after some of those workouts. She mentioned it improves power during that high hormone phase, which again is that luteal phase, and that creatine also helps to move the distribution of water into the muscles a little bit, which again can kind of contribute and help us feel less puffy, less soft overall. I know you guys know what I'm talking about if you struggle with this. So I thought that was super cool. And I'm hopefully I'm really, really trying to get the researcher and scientist on who works with creatine supplementation in pregnancy and like newborn neonatal health. So she is actually on maternity leave right now. So hopefully eventually we will have her on Wellness Fixes the Pod to chat about that, because I do think, knowing that I have a lot of friends who are pregnant, that I work with a lot of pregnant and postpartum women, I think that's a huge area that can, and a huge population that can benefit from creatine. And I know I have a lot of listeners who are either in that stage or thinking about that stage. And if creatine can possibly help at all, like that's something that I definitely want to implement. So I've also gotten feedback from the episode to go a little bit more into that ovulation testing that she was talking about. Again, we mentioned the menstrual cycle and how important it is to track the menstrual cycle. And she had mentioned the basics, so different apps possibly that we can utilize to track, basically creating this journal, this symptom journal of understanding and analyzing your basal body temperature. And I do that through my R ring. You can do that through a basal body thermometer. We go through some of the tracking stuff in the menstrual cycle series, so I'll refer you guys back to those episodes. But we didn't necessarily go into the ovulation testing component that she was talking about with they're like urine strips, they're like pH strips, right? And she was saying if you really want to know and understand a little bit better, you can do that. And so one of my listeners was confused on that and wanted me to dive in a little bit more. Oh, and cervical mucus, that's the other one that she had mentioned is like ways to check what phase you are in your cycle. So with the cervical mucus, it changes throughout your cycle, and sometimes people might have to actually assess themselves like while they are on the toilet, like ideally that way it's not like affected by urine or anything else. But seeing the consistency, and a lot of these apps have like, and you can even Google, like they have different consistencies like egg white or powdery salt, like they kind of describe it. So it's a little bit better to see one of those charts to see where your cervical mucus is on that range throughout your cycle. So that's one of the ways to chart your cycle. And then also, again, basal body thermometer, which that's a little easier. And my R ring is very, very consistent with the pattern, like my basal body thermometer, if that makes sense. So they were both very consistent. So I've actually gotten rid of the basal body thermometer and I just use my R ring. So both of those work. And then for ovulation testing, again, it's a urine strip, but you basically pee on the strip and like the little pH strips, it's kind of like that, but it's basically detects the level of luteinizing hormone, or LH. And I think she mentions this in the episode, but LH is luteinizing hormone and it peaks right before ovulation. So it'll give you a better measure of when you are switching from that follicular phase to that luteal phase. So just another like resource. And again, yes, it gets a little bit more time consuming and like just there's a lot more logistical things that you'd have to like do with the ovulation strips versus like an R ring, but I think multifactorial is best to understand your body a little bit better. And then also monitoring symptoms. So thinking, oh, I do get breast tenderness right before I'm about to start my period. Let me mark that down. Oh, I'm noticing that's consistent throughout the cycle. Oh, day 14, 15, I start to feel a little bit more bloated, oddly enough, and then it goes back to normal. So thinking about those symptoms, matching it with your basal body temperature, cervical mucus testing, and then ovulation testing with that LH, luteinizing hormone, like little pH strip to see where exactly you are ovulating month to month, cycle to cycle. And then last sort of top points before we move on to application, but her top tips for female athletes. I don't think we've spent too much time on this. And again, this is why I wanted to highlight it, but she said as her recommendations for female athletes is to lift the heavy weights and sprint fast. This goes back to the power. This goes back to some of the things that I feel like are not as trendy right now. There's a lot of Pilates and bar and yoga, and that's great. There's a lot of decreasing cortisol, lower intensity stuff. And again, I know we've chatted about cortisol and why it is actually good for us in the right dosages, but I love that she said sprint fast, lift the heavy weights, because I do feel like we are not prioritizing that or focusing on that as much. And it's something that's going to benefit us both now and in the future. As we age, those type 2 muscle fibers start to decline. So those are our quick twitch, fast, power-based muscle fibers. And as we age, those start to decline, transition a little bit to type 1. Some might even start to get like little fatty deposits in them. Like it's just our ability to maintain those gets harder as we age. And so if we can train those right now, especially in our 20s and 30s, that's going to help us, again, quick-based, power-based activities. That's going to help us with balance, fall risk, standing up from a chair as long as we can without using our hands. All of these sort of things that patients in their 70s and 80s are working on. So let's talk a little bit about in practice. And I'm going to write a blog post on this because I've tried to implement what she has talked about throughout the week. And so I'll just quickly chat on how I've tried to implement it, what I've noticed some of the challenges are, where I failed, where I felt like I've succeeded, all the things. So, starting off strong on Monday, like the Monday after the interview, I did a lower body day. I made sure to fuel with a banana and then 20 grams of protein powder in like a protein shake, almost like a self-made one. It's like the Clean Simple Eats protein powder and in like an almond milk. And it was a morning workout. I didn't quite get it in the recommended 30 to 60 minutes before, and it was not quite that like 2-to-1 ratio, but it was pretty close. So I was proud of myself for that. The workout felt great. I recovered great after. It was a Monday, so I felt like I was extra on top of my nutrition and my schedule for the day and just the plan for the day. So I felt really, really good then. It was a heavy workout day. So later in the day, I did like a 2-mile walk. I carved a little bit before that with a few sourdough crackers, but again, I could have done a little bit more. And then later in the day, same thing. I did I believe it was a 3-mile run. 3-mile jog, I think was Monday. And so again, I did some sourdough crackers. I could have fueled better before that for sure. Overall, the day was a little bit stressful work-wise and stressful, exciting. She mentioned EU stress in the episode, like EU stress, so like good stress. And it was definitely a good stress day, but I think I was using a lot of the energy reserves and the fueling that I had. Like I think I required more that day, not only because my activity had increased, but also because what I was putting my body and brain and all of that throughout the day with my work life was also a little bit more than normal. So I'd say overall, that was kind of how the week went. I was really good some days, like today, I just finished a workout and I prepped with, again, a banana and that same protein shake. I think the banana has 37 grams of carbs and the protein shake had maybe 21 grams of protein. So it's almost that like 2-to-1 ratio that she recommended prior to strength training. But I'm very much an on the whim exerciser, if that makes sense. Or in the morning. So I don't necessarily get that 30 to 60 minutes. So that's something that I'm going to try to work on. On my both lower body and upper body days this week, I took her lift heavy weights and sprint fast hard. Like I took that to heart. So I made sure to add in a lot of the power training, a lot of the speed training, even with my upper body. We have like an assault bike in our garage, which is the upper body and lower body bike, if y'all can picture those with the fans. So I did a lot of like sprint power intervals, even with my upper body. So I was able to incorporate that because I was like, you know what? Yes, I loved her recommendation for this. I need to incorporate this more throughout the week rather than just like one day of my hill sprints. Something that I'm looking forward to incorporating next cycle is that creatine loading that she talked about and seeing how I feel in my body, in my recovery, in my training with creatine loading throughout that luteal phase. When I filmed it, I was kind of deep in my luteal phase, and I don't know if I would have had the same experimentation that I would, next cycle when I'm like fresh in my luteal phase and have a bit of time to actually like load up on that creatine. The way that I utilize creatine, she mentioned a certain type of creatine, third party tested. I get that question a lot. And so the way that I drink it, I do drink mine as well. I think she said she did for hers too. I don't mind the grittiness necessarily. So I just get this basic creatine, put it in my water. But I had also heard, like Dr. Katie said, that it does dissociate in water. So first thing in the morning, I drink it, I get it out of the way in like less than probably like 2 minutes because I don't want it to dissociate and I want to get all of the benefits. So she had mentioned time of day doesn't really matter. So I'm doing it in the mornings because that's easier for me when I take all of my other supplements. But just for you guys to know how I'm putting that into practice. Something else that has been a challenge for me this week is I do feel like I am overall underfueled and I don't necessarily have the right ratios of things, or I could get closer. And again, if this is way too objective for you, then I totally understand. You don't have to be thinking about this as much as we talked about in that 2 to 3 to 1 ratio and then following it up with that 1 to 1 or what is, it doesn't have to be this objective. But for me, I am trying to put that into action because I do feel like that's the next step in my own sort of like journey to feel good and confident in my body and fuel my workouts in the right way. So I do think overall I run on that like low energy availability spectrum a little lower, where some of those days it's hard for me to get in that amount of carbs and protein. But I do think the more I expose myself to it, the better off I feel. And I've noticed even by incorporating more carbs and being more purposeful with carbs before my workout, I am not near as fatigued later in the day. So I think that plays into her talking about fatigue being a symptom of low energy availability. So overall, I feel like in practice, I'd give myself like a C or a B, I'd say. But again, it's only been a week. I think I have time to get to the point of implementing a lot of her like tips and tricks and heavily researched ratios for fueling and even pre-fueling. I think if I took nothing else from the interview, it's the importance of pre-fueling, tracking your menstrual cycle, carbs, not just like this like huge protein focus that's been lately, creatine being so important for women, and just overall realizing that our female physiology is different from a male's physiology, and our lives are different, and we might require more energy because we take on more of a mental load one day versus another in our work life or in our mom life or whatever it might be. So there's this whole overarching approach to looking at the female body and our everyday athlete selves. So that's my quick little debrief, how I've actually applied some of her tips and tricks into my life over this last week. And again, I'm going to try and write a blog post. It's already started about more of a breakdown. If you guys want actual like 7 a.m. I did this, 8 a.m., 9 a.m. breakfast, 11 a.m., like all of these sorts of time points so that you can be like, oh, my hope is that it's like, oh, Kelsey did it this way. I prefer to do it this way. Or, oh, she failed at this. This is actually easy for me, but I'm struggling with something that she struggled or didn't struggle with as much. So it's more of like inspiration and hopefully understanding that I am also learning with my body, and to give your body a little bit of grace and yourself a little bit of grace when it comes to trying to implement all of these things that we're learning about, because I never want to overcomplicate things. My goal is to simplify. And so if you take something from this that's just like, I've got to pre-fuel, whatever that means, I think you are leaps and bounds like helping your body more than what you'd even realize, even though you didn't quite get that ratio that she wanted, or those 30 to 60 minutes before that she wanted. Or same thing with creatine. It's like, okay, if you're only just now implementing it, great, it's totally okay. If you don't want to utilize or creatine load in the luteal phase, that's okay. It's just more information and more knowledge to share with us about our bodies, and I think it's cool to learn where the research is headed, right? So I hope you guys got a lot out of this debrief, pod club, breakdown for the baddies episode. I loved Dr. Katie's episode. I'm excited for you guys to hear the episode we have next week with a colleague of Dr. Katie's and someone who also is going to provide just wonderful, actionable insight and tips for how we need to fuel and think about fueling and body image as women. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Let me know if you guys have any other questions. I'd love to answer them. If you guys have an idea for what to title these episodes, I'm all ears. So thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you guys again on the next episode of Wellness Fixes the Pod.